All right, I think we're good to go to get started. If you guys want to say hi in the little chat bubble so I know who's here, feel free. Can't exactly see who is here, how many people are here. We'll get started. My name is Dr. Hayden Cortland. My background is a little bit unusual. I spent many years studying science. I've got a undergrad degree in biochemistry, did a master's in anatomy physiology, PhD in orthopedics, and I did a fellowship after that, and I was a research scientist for many years. I actually got into exercise and training when I was a grad student, and basically kind of was doing it on my own without really investigating it seriously, which is sort of ironic for a scientist. Ultimately, I hit a wall because I didn't really know what I was doing. I, at that point, then found CrossFit and got involved in that. And after doing that for a little bit, I also hit a wall for various reasons. And then I decided to kind of take it a little bit more seriously and really kind of take it with a scientific approach and actually investigate, what was known in terms of the research that's been done and speak to people that had a lot of experience doing it. And as I took that approach, that's basically how I wound up encountering starting strength and studied that, eventually did all the training that was necessary and became a starting strength coach, which is why I'm here today. Currently, I don't do research anymore. I am a coach at Solace New York, which is in New York City. I'm actually the head strength coach currently. And Solace is pretty unique. It's a very big gym. It has over 500 members, and we have a lot of offerings. So we offer specialty classes in strength, so starting strength. We also offer weightlifting. We offer CrossFit, generic HIIT classes, and bodybuilding classes. So what I basically have is a melting pot of pretty much every type of person that might want to be doing some kind of training. And so what I have found was that there was pretty much a common theme among all of these individuals, which was trying to understand how they would reach their goals or do what they want to do, given that there was always some strength component that was required and there was always some sort of desire for conditioning. And very often the two were at odds, and people are constantly not really understanding what to do about this. And so one of the things that I try to do is I try to clarify as much as possible, the pros and cons of both and how to put them together if individuals want to do that. And so what I'll talk about today is basically that, how we would pair or periodize strength and conditioning and why potentially you'd want to do it and some of the risks if you are doing it. So I'm basically going to go from pretty simple to a little bit more complex as I go through this. It's not really meant to be lecture style, so if you have questions, feel free to just type in the message window there and ask me questions. I'll check it periodically and I'll answer your questions as we go. You don't have to wait until the end to ask questions. So the first part basically would just be conditioning. What do we mean by that? It's also often called metabolic conditioning. And basically, it's dealing with training of the energy systems in our body. So the three main systems are creatine phosphate, which is going to be giving you energy for maximum durations that are up to about 12 seconds. You then got the glycolytic system, which will enable you to get basically supplying you for energy in max effort bouts that are up to about a minute. You're kind of pushing it a little bit at that range. And then once you get beyond that, the aerobic energy system basically has to kick in and really supply a lot of the energy for doing those activities. Ultimately, all three tend to be working at the same time when you're doing most activities, but certain ones will be biased at different times. So really conditioning is training these systems and making your body more efficient at basically creating energy and delivering that energy to your tissues so that you can function, whatever that task is that you want to be doing. So the first question that basically I ask people is, why is it that they want to do conditioning? And I think it's an important question to understand why people want to do things, because it's then going to inform in a better way what you have them do. All right. So there's a couple kind of major reasons why people would do conditioning. First of which is for health reasons. And there's a lot of studies out there that, basically talk about the importance of being active. And these studies vary in terms of the type of conditioning that's being done, but there's a common theme of, improving metabolic markers, lowering risk for disease, the more active you are. In some cases, it's really is just an increase in activity level. So simply doing strength training is going to give you a little bit of that benefit, right? So, I mean, anytime we're doing an activity, we're going to be using our energy systems. So you will get some conditioning from doing strength training, but usually there's a kind of a higher level of it that people want when they have these conversations with me. So general health, disease prevention, stuff like that is one reason people will want to do conditioning. Another reason that they'll often want to do it is because they want to affect changes to their body composition. So dropping fat in particular is going to be one of the things that people are trying to do by incorporating conditioning into their program. This is something that actually is a little bit tricky. It's not as easy as one would think. For a lot of people, nutrition really is going to be the major player for that. So if you want to affect changes in your body composition, you're really going to need to start with nutrition. For some people, the effect of adding conditioning on top of that will be noticeable, but it's just not going to generally give you as big a bang for your buck if you're doing sensible conditioning. If you really, really kind of overdo it with conditioning and really stress your body, you can then start seeing, additional changes, but it's not really the healthiest way to do it. It's certainly going to cause problems if we want to be focusing on strength, which is going to be very important for overall health. So doing it to drop body composition, not the best approach. You can get a little bit of an assist there sometimes, but if that's going to be the major focus, I'm usually going to tell people, well, we need to dial this back a little bit and let's look at other things first, because it can be very tricky to do that. It's kind of like a cart before the horse for most people. Another reason that people want to do it is they want to basically improve their ability to play sports, do outdoor activity, play with their kids. Also, it's going to improve any kind of activity. So if you're lifting, at some point, conditioning can assist you with your ability to do strength training as well as that progresses. And then the one that probably, whether or not people say it to me and are honest about it, the one that probably is most common is that it is fun for people. There's lots of different ways to do conditioning now with group classes, and people just really like it. I think to some extent people get addicted to it a little bit. And this is also where you then run into, I think, the most problems with adding conditioning to your training, because basically it becomes a fun factor, enjoyment, and then you start forgetting about actually training or creating a program that has the proper steps to reach a goal. All right. So we'll kind of circle back to that a little bit later. It'll come up again as we go through this. So there's a bunch of different reasons to do conditioning. I'm not saying that, any of them are wrong. Basically, you take those for what they are in terms of what the individual wants, and you're basically going to, try to create a good program that works based on what they want. So, hold on one second here. I just wanted to, got a message here about, I'm not sure I actually see the comments. Haven't really seen one since a few minutes ago. So if you guys can just give a couple of quick comments, any of you guys that are watching, just want to make sure that things are working right here. So just anybody, post anything that you've got, just say hi or something in the comments so I can see. Okay, so we'll move on to the next topic, which is basically what modality is going to be best for conditioning. There's generally, cool, thanks Ryan. Just want to make sure that people can actually post comments if they need to. So there's two kind of general types of conditioning that people are going to do. One is going to be aerobic training, and the other one is going to be sort of high intensity interval training. Those are the general two categories. So aerobic training is basically going to be using your aerobic energy system. It's going to be very oxygen dependent. It's the kind of training that's going to enable you to do lots of work over a long period of time. So intensity levels are generally going to be lower. And it's the kind of training you would do if you were going to run a marathon. All right, so you got to cover a long distance. It's going to take a long time. And based on the data that we have, that type of training is going to be at odds with strength training. And we're going to kind of stage this conversation from the viewpoint that strength is going to be most important. That's really got to be your starting point. So if that's the case, and you're now going to pair aerobic training with what you're doing, there's a little bit of a risk there. All right, aerobic training has been shown pretty convincingly to be, if it's the focus of what you're doing, something that will inhibit growth in muscle size, it'll inhibit strength, and will inhibit power. So you've got to be very careful there. The extreme example of that is if you look at marathon runners, people that specialize in that, you can see their body types. They're extremely thin. They have very little muscle mass. All right, so that's kind of like the far end of the spectrum of focusing on that. So the better option to incorporate into your training would be high intensity interval training. So this is usually going to be some sort of training that is created in like a work-rest ratio, and it's going to be short bouts where you're going to work fairly high intensity, whatever that is for you, and then you'll have rests interspersed in there. So these tend to be very good. They don't really interfere nearly as much with strength training, and they actually are able to give you improvements to both your aerobic and your anaerobic energy systems. There's a lot of studies that have shown this. Tabata is probably like the famous researcher that showed this, but there's other papers that are out there by Wisloff and Gabal that show the same thing. So basically, the shorter high intensity duration exercises are what you're generally going to want to gear towards when you do this type of training. It's not to say you can't do aerobic training. It's totally fine, but you just want to make sure that the emphasis is right so that you don't negatively influence the strength training program, which presumably is going to be the focus of what you do. Because ultimately, strength is going to make you better at everything else, and it becomes extremely important as you get older. Because as you get older, you tend to lose muscle mass, tend to lose bone mass just as a part of the aging process. So it's something we really want to protect as much as possible. So we've got those two types of training modalities, aerobic or anaerobic. The HIIT style is definitely the best. And so once we kind of focus on that, the question then becomes, what is the format that we're going to use, and what kind of exercises would we be using to do this? So for the format, certainly anything that you can control or you can program or a coach can program for you is going to be the best. You're going to get the best results if something is customized. So in that kind of mindset, if you're taking a group class, that is not going to be as effective, right? It's not going to take into account, any kind of strength training that you're doing currently. It's not going to be customized to your needs and particular goals. So there's certainly a limitation there if you go into a group setting. So it'd be better if something that is, basically programmed specifically for you. In a class setting, you'll probably get improvements when you first start doing it, but that's pretty common for everything, right? The first time you do any type of training, you're going to get improvements and you're going to get beginner gains. But then at that point after that, you're not really going to get the improvement that you want unless you're targeting your program in a particular way to achieve that goal. So for conditioning, group classes are not going to be the best. Customizing and individualizing what you're doing is going to be the best. So Brian wrote the question, what do you want to do for someone who wants both weights and conditioning, strength and conditioning, yeah. So, well, that's what we're talking about. So we're going to talk about how you would put the two together based on the different phases of your training. And so we're going to kind of go through it little by little, starting with, the novice linear progression and then going through that. But before we do that, just in terms of the movements that you're going to want to be using for this, it's another important thing to consider. You've got to be careful what you choose for movements. So we generally like to use movements that are low impact and have low or no eccentric movement. And ideally, if they can allow aerobic and anaerobic training, so the high intensity training as well as some of the slower training, that would be good just to have that variability. And so like the common ones that we often promote would be the prowler, the rower, and the bike. So one of the previous Facebook Lives, Cassie talked about the rower. That was a great one. It's a super useful tool. You can do a lot of different things on the rower. I like it a lot. Bike is really great as well. Prowler is kind of like the gold standard of not having to worry too much about the eccentric loading of the other muscles. So those are kind of like, the staples of what I think most people would recommend to add conditioning-wise to your strength training. If you start branching out and doing other movements, which we'll talk about coming up, you certainly can do that. but it starts becoming a little bit more complicated in terms of how those might affect your program and recovery. So one of the things you do want to think about along those lines is you want to be choosing movements that are going to be safe options for you as well. So running and jogging is something that a lot of people like to do, but in a way it's kind of like one of the most dangerous things you can do, in the sense that like it's very, in those kind of movements, you're usually, I mean, most people aren't running on a track. They're not usually in a controlled environment. Usually people are out like running on the street or running in a park or hiking or like up a hill or something like that. The risk of like twisting an ankle or something is fairly high in my personal experience. So you actually wind up putting a lot of risk, into that particular endeavor, which really wouldn't be there if you were in a controlled environment, sitting on a rower or sitting on a bike indoors, like an assault bike or something like that. So you do want to kind of keep that in the back of your mind. The more complicated the exercise movement gets as well, you start using free weights and stuff like that, which we'll talk about at the end, you have the same kind of safety and risk issue there as well. You're increasing the number of variables that have to be accounted for at the same time. So try to keep, if possible, keep things simple as much as you can. It's going to be easier to control the programming, and it's going to be easier to control like the kind of results that you're getting, if possible. So thoughts on the curve type treadmill, like the Assault Air Runner. Yeah, so if you're going to be like doing running and you want to try to do that like indoors, you want to try to integrate that into your programming, I think that's a better option. So I've definitely been in gyms that have had the True Form Runner or the Assault Air Runner. It's a much more controlled environment, so you're on a belt. It's less likely to have steps that are going to, twist your ankle and stuff like that. So I think it's a better option. I do like the True Form ones, the Air Runners, the curvature of them, I think makes for a more natural strike of the foot. I've found quite a lot of people I've encountered, myself included, on a typical treadmill, you're not getting the right mechanics. A lot of people would have like shin issues doing it. So if you want to be doing running, you can certainly, I think that would be a better option. But one of the things to consider there is, what's the intensity going to be if you're doing running? Like how high can you get your intensity level up on the machine? If you're just going to be kind of running at a low intensity pace, again, you're going to be in that aerobic range, and you're not going to get a tremendous amount of benefit if that's your focus, unless you're doing a ton of it, and then it's going to work against you. It's pretty hard to get high intensity on the running machines in a comfortable way. I've seen people do it, but they're running very, very fast on, basically an unstable surface. It still has a belt that's spinning around. So, there's the safety issue comes up again when you start using this machine and you start increasing the intensity. Whereas you just wouldn't have that risk if you were doing it with like an assault bike or a rower. No matter how hard you pull or pedal on those, you're not risking being thrown off the machine, which potentially could happen even on a True Form Runner or Assault Air Runner. So certainly could be something you can cycle in, but I'd be careful with the high intensity aspect of your conditioning if you're using that. Okay, so, all right, so how do we start kind of matching these to different types of programs? So we'll start at the very beginning, where we always recommend people start, which is with the Novice Linear Progression, all right? So pretty much everyone is going to start with that. They're going to be training generally 3 days a week. They're going to be adding 5 pounds to the bar initially for pretty much every lift. So they'll slow down a little bit, 2.5 pounds for some of the upper body. So we're doing the Novice Linear Progression. What do we basically recommend people do in terms of pairing conditioning with this? The recommendation is we don't pair it at all. All right. Why is that? Well, as I said before, strength is more important. And this is a time where you can get like the most strength in the shortest period of time. So we want to maximize that. At most, and probably not even for most people, your Novice Linear Progression is going to be over in 9 months. It's probably going to be less than that. So it's not really that long to just focus on the strength training and not worry about conditioning, all right? The other thing about it as well is that this is, if you were to start pairing conditioning with this phase, your workouts are now becoming a little bit longer. You're going to have to try to manage that. And you're also going to take some of your attention away from the strength training, which should really be the focus of your novice linear progression. There's going to be some technique things you've got to sort out. You're probably going to have to sort out your nutrition and your sleep and understand how to, work with coaching feedback and cues, and, having a whole nother thing of conditioning or learning those movements and having to worry about that stuff is just, it's just unnecessary. It complicates things a little bit too much. So we really recommend that you just don't worry too much about that, in the beginning. So Andy commented he got strong on LP, but like the skiing destroyed him because it was high intensity and lasted for well over an hour, right? Because that's kind of like when the wall hits. So it seems that any aerobic training for this activity has to last at least an hour. The correct energy system is not trained. Well, yeah, I mean, that's the thing. By definition, if you're doing something for an hour, it's no longer high intensity. So maybe if you broke it up into individual pieces and you rested enough and to reset your system, you could then have high intensity in those individual bouts. But at some point, if you keep going through that, even if you are resting, you're continuing to train. If you're hitting an hour of training, usually, it becomes very aerobic. You just start getting drained. You just don't have the ability to recover all the systems completely. So, for aerobic training, it's going to be long. It's going to be, if you're hitting an hour, it's definitely largely going to be aerobic, All right. So where are we at? Okay. So novice linear progression, ultimately, we don't really want to be adding conditioning, if at all possible. Stick with the program, do the program as written, get the gains you can get out of it. It's going to be the most efficient time for you to get it. And, why not get it as quickly as you can? Makes everything else a lot quicker, makes everything else easier and more productive, whatever else you want to do. So what then we get to is, if we no longer rank novice, we've started to make some modifications to the program, start to become an advanced novice or an intermediate. We're starting to add some light days for the squat, taking smaller jumps, alternating out the deadlift a little bit more with other lifts, things like that. In those kind of situations, you might be able to add conditioning. I think in general, myself and others would still probably say, wait a little bit, still focus on the strength training. But at this point, it's not uncommon for some people to want to start doing something. So recommendation would be to start adding it gradually, maybe 1 or 2 times a week. Again, the way that I suggested with, one of these kind of safe implements like the rower, the prowler, something along those lines. You may have to kind of learn and get used to the movement. If you've not done any kind of like sports or anything like that recently, you may be very deconditioned potentially. Just kind of depends. I mean, the end of your novice linear progression is pretty rough. So you do get some conditioning out of that. So you may need to take a little bit easy just to get adjusted to the movements and using the muscles in those ways. So 1 or 2 times a week. Generally recommending adding it after your strength pieces, so on your regular strength training days. That way you still have your rest days as they are, would be the recommendation. And, you just have to keep an eye on it, increase it slowly if you want to, or as you're able to. Do you have to add it after LP? No, you don't. I mean, you don't have to right away. I think the decision to add it is going to be basically up to you and your coach and your goals. So it also goes back to kind of like the goals that I listed at the top. At some point, not doing conditioning may affect your ability to actually get heavier and heavier weights. It may actually start affecting your training. You may find yourself being kind of out of breath. So there is a point where the conditioning is going to help you continue with your strength training, for example, if that's your focus. And so it's something that you just have to keep an eye on. You can delay it for a while if you want, but you should keep an eye on it because it may be necessary at some point, depending on what kind of background you have. Like as an example, someone that in the past has done a lot of sports or a lot of like HIIT classes and stuff like that, they start doing their novice linear progression, they're probably not going to need it right after the linear progression for the sake of being conditioned, because they have this training history of doing a lot of conditioning that is going to carry them through. I have found, it's been my experience. Certainly their conditioning won't be as high as it was when they were just doing conditioning, But there does seem to be, in my experience, some baseline level of adaptation that increases if you do a lot of conditioning. That kind of carries you through a bit. So you don't have to do it. It's just going to be a question about your goals and, keeping an eye on it in terms of, when you get to the point where maybe it would be affecting your strength training, you're getting out of breath constantly when you're doing your sets and so forth. All right. Cool. All right. So someone asked about implements that are going to be a little bit more complicated to add to conditioning. We'll get to those coming up. More complicated training modalities like kettlebells and stuff like that. Okay. So adding a couple times a week to start when you're out of your linear progression and kind of more of an advanced novice, early intermediate and stuff like that. And you just have to keep an eye on the potential problems. All right. We've got potential issues of recovery just not going as well as you would like, which is one of the reasons why if you compare it on the same day that you're doing your strength training, it can help you. Another option to kind of help with recovery is usually there's a 2-day rest in there if you're doing a 3-day week training program. As like Saturday, Sunday will often be the rest for Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Having some extra conditioning on Saturday is not as bad because you still have Sunday potentially to rest. So that's another option of where you can put things in. But you really got to be focused on managing your recovery. Another option is putting it a little bit earlier in the week. So if you had a Monday, Wednesday, Friday training split, putting a little bit of extra conditioning on Tuesday. Let's say you couldn't do it on Monday because you were pressed for time. So putting a little bit in there on Tuesday wouldn't be as damaging, most likely, as kind of putting it in towards the end of the week on Thursday when you've had like 2 days of training that you're trying to recover from. All right. So some of the considerations there. And basically the biggest problem that, I kind of see is when people want to start adding more conditioning, but they want to start adding conditioning that has lots of different implements and movements and variety and variation and changes in rep ranges and volume and all that. So I'm basically speaking to, what can eventually become like a HIIT class or a CrossFit class. All right. So it doesn't have to start out that way. I mean, certainly like what Mike just said in the comments, he wants to throw in some conditioning. He's got 54-pound kettlebells, jump rope, plyo boxes. So, if you're doing something yourself and you're kind of focused on what you're doing, then using those can be totally fine. I mean, you can use a kettlebell, you can do kettlebell swings, jump roping, some monostructural movement. That can also be fine, adding some conditioning. Plyo boxes for box jumps, again, think back to the safety, right? Are you getting, a good enough bang for your buck with that? Jumping up in a box, even if you're going to step down, not the best movement to do in terms of safety. There's a lot of variables there. The risk of falling is pretty high. All right. So that's something that you want to kind of keep an eye on. But you can basically use a lot of these other movements in high intensity ways, right? So if you've got a kettlebell, you got a jump rope, you can do high intensity intervals with those. You can do, 20 seconds of kettlebell swings, rest for 20 seconds, switch to the jump rope, do 15 seconds of jump roping, rest, something like that, do a few rounds of that, and then you're good to go. The nice thing about high intensity training is you're not doing it for an hour, You're doing it for a very short period of time, trying to have the intensity be very high, and then that's it. And then you move on, all right? And so, in terms of the weight, well, yeah, so 54-pound kettlebell, as Mike is commenting here, it doesn't seem like, much, weight for someone who's got a 410 squat and a 475-pound deadlift. It's not, but you're not really trying to use the weight as the driver of the conditioning stimulus, right? I mean, if you had the weight that is extremely high, something that would be a higher percentage of what you could squat or your deadlift, you're now really risking interfering with your strength training, all right? Because you now have heavy loads that you have to somehow try and recover from, all right? So you really want the loads for the conditioning to not be super, super heavy so that you can better manage the recovery. That's the idea behind it. So yeah, so if you like a shorter workout, 10 to 15 minutes, and the weight doesn't have to be, super heavy. Now, if you are very, very strong, the weight is certainly you want to probably be a little bit heavier than someone who's not very strong, right? So someone who's extremely weak may have to start out with like a 16 kilo, kettlebell or something like that, or even less than that. But if you're reasonably strong, then you can use a heavier kettlebell because it's not going to be very taxing to you. But for a lot of these implements, you're not really going to get a weight that is going to match and tax someone who's very, very strong, unless you start trying to put barbells in your movements for your conditioning. Then you could theoretically get weights that are very, very heavy, that are very close to or even, your training weights. And then I think just intuitively, you realize that, okay, if I'm using a weight that's close to my training weight and I'm using it in conditioning, then this is going to be potentially a significant recovery problem, so you have to really keep an eye on that. So weight's not really crucial for the conditioning effect. It's really about the time frame in terms of the intensity and the work, and then the rest, the ratio of those are really what you're going for. All right. So I kind of basically, got to the point now where we're talking about like the class setting. And I think a lot of you are familiar with this. If you take a HIIT class, a generic HIIT class, like a boot camp class, they're not really going to have, heavy weights or anything like that. But those classes are not 10 or 15 minutes. They're an hour, right? So you are working and doing movements, doing conditioning pieces for an hour, something like that, or 50 minutes. So that's a long period of time. And depending on how the classes are structured, the volume of work, the number of repetitions that you're doing can be extremely high. We actually have a HIIT class at Solace, and one of the things we've done recently, which is long overdue, is put some restrictions on how many reps that people are doing, because they could just be extremely high, and volume is something that can be very difficult for people to recover from. So that's one of the considerations with these classes, is that you're just going to be doing so much work that, it's a competition in terms of your resources. Is that going to just drain you so much that you can't do your strength training properly? There's also a possibility of just, working too much in different ways and angles where you get sore, and then that affects you, psychologically as you're trying to do your strength training, so that's a problem as well. With the CrossFit classes and stuff like that, it's a huge risk, as I kind of alluded to before, because now you're adding weighted movements that are very complicated, and, people tend to get into it, they get excited, their egos get involved, and they want to start putting more weight on the bar, and there's always like a prescribed weight, something like that, and all of a sudden you just completely lose track of, what the focus was, what the goal was, which is having a properly crafted program that's going to help me get strong and help me maintain my strength and go forward with that. And I've got all these other variables, that are interspersed there, and I've got to try to recover from that. And it's very difficult, and it's very tricky to do that. All right. So Jacob posted a comment saying a 66-year-old male, has been a starting strength for a few years, currently on HLM, only interested in getting strong and healthy so you can play with your grandkids, right? No interest in competitions. Be interested in doing some conditioning once a week. If I do it on training days, you recommend doing conditioning before or after the strength training. So you should, in my recommendation, is do your strength first, prioritize your strength, and then do your conditioning afterwards. Again, it's limited resources. Whatever you do first, you're going to be freshest for. So it's going to get potentially everything you've got could go towards that, and then whatever is left over can go towards the conditioning. You certainly could do it the other way around. You could put the conditioning first and do the strength afterwards, but what you're going to find is you're just not going to perform as well in the strength on certain days. Maybe not every day, but a lot of the days, most of the days, you're going to have the issues where you're just not going to perform as well in the modality that is second. All right, so I would always do the strength first and then do the conditioning afterwards, which would align with the priority on the strength as you do it. Okay, so basically we kind of talked about pairing. If you guys have any other questions on pairing the two together, you can continue to post them there. I'll answer them. But I just wanted to try to finish with one of the other kind of options that is out there for people. And so basically this is what I had to do at my gym, because we have so many offerings. is I had to try to accommodate these people that wanted to do different things. So as much as possible, I basically, suggested what I just told you guys. It's like, let's focus on the strength training. Let's add a little bit of conditioning in on the same days, and take it that way. But unfortunately, we have, a lot of people that have a lot of different interests. And so they want to go and they want to take weightlifting. They want to go and they want to take a HIIT class or CrossFit or something like that, because for whatever reasons, it could just be that they like those classes. So, I want them to get strong, and, I don't want to just completely ignore those people because they want to do other things. I mean, it really is no different if someone, let's say you're a runner and you want to do marathons periodically, or you want to play soccer or something like that. I mean, you can consider all of this extra conditioning really as like extra sport or extra play. And how do you deal with that? So a couple of the things that I kind of came up with was as follows. One of the things that I would recommend people do is kind of, if they really want to be doing other things a lot, as opposed to more than just once or twice a week, I would recommend that they do a periodized structure to their strength training. And again, ideally, they do their novice linear progression. They get through that. They get their novice gains. They've kind of paid their dues. And then we start having this kind of conversation. So what I'll recommend they do is I'll recommend that they, kind of do a block of strength, several months of strength. And then if they want, they can take a couple of months off and do their other things, HIIT class, whatever it is, they want to be doing, sports, stuff like that, and then come back and then go back into the strength, with strength being the focus. So you're kind of periodizing the blocks of the month. So a couple months of strength, a couple months where the focus is not strength, but it's something else, like your HIIT classes if you want, or your sport or your running, whatever it is you're doing, and then go back. So you kind of alternate months or blocks over the year. And this actually works pretty well. So what it is it's almost like kind of like a built-in deload. So if they're doing strength pretty religiously, they're going to be pretty, tired. They're going to be, pretty worn down by the end of, let's say, 2 months or 8 weeks of that, of focusing on it. And so they kind of like get a little bit of a deload. They do other things, and then they come back. The way we have it at Solace's cycles to doing strength. If you're, kind of just out of your linear progression and you're doing that, it tends to work pretty well. You'll usually be able to kind of reset a little bit and build up again. A lot of people will kind of pass their old maxes that they had in a linear progression. You don't have to do too much strength maintenance in between those blocks, as long as the blocks are just like kind of a month or two off. Initially, the more you strength train, the further along your potential you get, having the periodized blocks is going to make it a little bit difficult to not do any strength in between those blocks. So what you're going to have to do is you're going to actually have to do more strength during the non-strength blocks if you want to maintain your strength and you want to actually get future strength goals down the road. So this is one of the things that you have to kind of keep in the back of your mind. The more serious you are about strength, you're going to have to kind of keep doing it a little bit more and more down the road. All right. So you have to be a little bit careful of that. Initially, though, when you're kind of new to it, you can do the periodization and kind of reset and build back up again, and it's not that big of a deal. But for someone like me, for example, who's went through their novice linear progression, is clearly an intermediate, pretty deep into it, I can't just do that. I can't go. In fact, I think I did this 2 years ago, and it kind of messed me up as I kind of like took a couple of months off, and I just did kind of random stuff. And then I kind of went back to the program, and it was just like, oh my God, I'm so far away from where I was. It was just very difficult to ramp back up again. It set me back a lot. So the more advanced you are, the more you'll have to do strength during these kind of off seasons or off blocks if you're doing other things. So you got to kind of keep that in the back of your mind. And that's another common request that I get from people is that, they're pretty dedicated to strength, let's say, but when the summer comes around, it becomes a problem. Even if it's just they want to be outdoors more and ride a bike and be on the beach and stuff like that. So the request for an off season, a summer off, often comes. And that's fine as well, right? So then most of the year is strength. You just got a couple months in the middle where you're not really focusing on strength. So that's fine as well. But again, if you're someone that has been doing it a lot, you're more advanced in your training, you're going to have to be doing some strength training during that period of time. It just wouldn't necessarily have to be as focused or as difficult as it would be during the main training block. And this is something where you have to work it out with your coach, depending on, where you're at in your training. They'll have to kind of talk to you about that and determine where you're at, based on your history, to be able to balance the two of them. So what are the HIIT work rest intervals you find most effective in total duration? I think ultimately you're going to want to do some variation of the intervals, just because, for several reasons. I mean, your body is going to adapt to whatever stress that it gets. So if it gets a particular type of interval all the time, you're going to become adapted to it, and it's going to be very difficult to make changes or progress. And that's one of the reasons why you're going to want to probably add some aerobic training, aerobic conditioning in there at some point, because you're going to be trying to move the needle for your overall conditioning, and you're going to need to have a little bit more variation in your programming to do that. But the Tabata interval is a classic one. It's 20 seconds of max effort work, 10 seconds of rest. It's very difficult. It's a grueling interval to do. But then you can still play around with a lot of these intervals. I mean, you can do, intervals of 30 seconds. You can do, the common work rest ratios are going to be 3-to-1, 2-to-1, 1-to-1. Those will be the common work rest ratios that people are going to cycle through and make sure they get exposure to all of those. And how long each of those are, it can vary. I mean, you can, the shorter they are, like a 20 second to 10 second versus a 3 minutes to 1 minute, right? Your intensity is going to vary proportionately, right? The lower the interval, the less time it is, the easier it's going to be for you to get the intensity high. The longer the time period is, you're not going to be able to quite get as high an intensity. You won't be able to maintain it. So there's benefit to both, right? Because there's multiple energy systems and they overlap. Ultimately, the aerobic one is the baseline that kind of fuel and supports everything. So you do want to go into some of those slightly longer ranges, if possible. Hi, Todd. Glad to see you're doing well. Andy said he took 3 months off for skiing. Coming back was a bear, but doable and easier than your novice linear progression. So that's exactly it. I mean, the same thing for me when I took a couple of months off doing random things. I don't know what I was thinking. When I went back, it was awful, but at the same time, I was still stronger than I was years ago, right? That's one of the great things about strength. It takes forever to develop it, but it lasts quite a long time, so you're not going to revert all the way back, to before you started training if you take a couple of months off. What you will find, and what gets, kind of rough if you're really serious about this and continue to train, is that you're going to get closer and closer to your genetic potential. If you look at that graph in Starting Strength, the book, and when you get really closer and closer to your genetic potential, like you're going to probably notice those drops, those decreases in performance or strength when you take time off. It's going to be a little bit more obvious to you, and it's a little bit kind of harder to deal with, because generally you've fought so hard to get those. There's a lot of work to get them, But, in the grand scheme of things, for people that just want to be relatively strong and good health, and are okay with getting stronger and taking a little bit of a break, coming back and building it up again, getting a little bit stronger over the long term, a long period of time, it's totally fine and totally doable. You just got to really watch how much you're balancing the two and make sure that the strength doesn't drop off too much. Make sure you're thinking about it in a careful way so that it gets the due that it needs to have to get you where you want to be. All right. So I think those are kind of the main points I wanted to cover. Pairing it is going to be, probably the recommended way of doing it, and just pairing it as needed for your goals, keeping strength to be the emphasis. If you really want to have blocks where you focus on running or competition or group fitness and stuff like that, you're going to have to be very careful pairing that with strength. It interferes a lot for a lot of people, particularly if they're kind of new to that or not very strong to begin with. Very problematic. So periodizing is a better approach to that if you really feel like you have to do that or want to do that. But either way, you really should be thinking about strength being the priority in the overall larger scheme of your training, because it's going to help you be better at everything. It's going to help you be safer at everything as well. How does periodization change for someone who's 40 plus? It doesn't have to. I am 40 plus. I'm the low end of that. I'm 43. So you can still do that. I think what winds up happening, when you get to these different age groups is that your goals change a little bit and your ability to recover changes, right? So my recovery is not anywhere near where it was when I was younger. So if I was like just to go right now into group fitness, it would be very difficult. I probably would have to change things drastically. I probably would have to pick my classes that I was going to be able to recover. So, I think that's, as you get older, really you want to be focusing more on programming that is specific to you and your goals. And you got to be very careful about the group classes that you take if you're going to be doing that. But you can still do it. You can still periodize if you wanted to. You would just have to, keep an eye on your strength levels and determine, do you really want to have them be an emphasis, which I think they should be. So your off months would still have to be thought of like, okay, what do I really need to do for the strength to really have a good return to a full strength program a month or two from now, and like really focus there, and then add, the conditioning and the stuff in around that. And that's probably what I'm going to have to do. Like once everything opens again and I can go out and go back to coaching and all that, I'll probably will do that as well. I'll probably kind of have an off season, but the focus is going to be on the strength. It's going to be, all right, what do I have to do during this off-season time to make sure that I'm in good shape when I go back and focus on it, all right? Mike asked, what's the most hard conditioning I can come up with? There's so many CrossFit workouts that will fit that, just perfectly. It's just, just way too much weight and way too much volume is really just what's going to make a hard conditioning piece, I don't know if you meant hard bad or hard good, really hard good means something that you could do is, the Tabatas are really just the worst, and doing a Tabata on a salt bike is just murder. It's just really, really, really difficult to do. I think when the studies, when he did this was years ago, like the people that were doing it were like, just like near death. They were being pushed so hard, they were doing it. So that's certainly, I think in terms of the work rest range, for conditioning, for high intensity conditioning, that's like the worst interval. It's pretty bad. And doing it on a salt bike is particularly bad, I found as well. So, be careful, like don't just throw that in constantly in your training. You can do it every now and then, but you got to be careful of that, that can drain on you as well if you go too high in your intensity. You got to be careful. I think relative intensity is a good term to be substituting. It's got to be something that, is going to stimulate the adaptations in your body, but not something that is going to kill you, not drive you under the ground. So you got to be careful with that. Is a fan bike like the Rogue Echo Bike a good device for the kind of conditioning you're talking about? Yeah, so we've had the assault bikes in the past. They're really brutal. They don't last very long, though, if they're used highly, like in a class setting. So we actually switched to the Echo bikes. Those are also very difficult as well. So I think for, properly thought out and planned conditioning, all those bikes are fine if you like biking, perfectly fine, Strength is the glass, fitness is the water. Yep. So yeah, strength should be, obviously I'm biased, I'm a starting strength coach. Strength is the pillar of all this. It's going to make you better and everything else. So that should really be the focus, and then you should be thinking about, all right, how do I arrange everything around that? To keep moving in that direction, to get stronger, or as I get older, as a master's athlete, to, maintain my strength. It kind of switches to that as well, as much as possible, All right. So I think that's all I've got. Any final questions? You guys certainly can contact me off of here, either Instagram, Dr. Cortland. I'm on the Starting Strength Coach Registry. I've got a website as well, Science for Fitness, FOR. But any other questions before we wrap it up? All right, looks like that's it. So thank you all so much for listening. We got one more question. How do you program sled pushing for the older folks? I wouldn't necessarily say that would have to be too much different for someone that's younger. I think it's a question of, what are you starting at? What kind of experience do you have with conditioning? and building up to something that you can handle, So I wouldn't start with something that was really, really high max effort, 20 seconds, 10 seconds for someone that's just starting it out, particularly someone who's a master's athlete. I'd probably have them start out at a moderate pace, all right, and do some intervals. So you could do a moderate pace of, pushing something like, 20 seconds, and then give yourself the same or a little bit more amount of rest time just to recover. And then you're going to have to build up gradually, little by little, as you go, as the program progresses, So there has to be kind of an adaptation to what you're doing, just like there would be in the beginning of your novice linear progression, right? So we find a working weight, where the last rep slows maybe a little bit, and then we kind of keep an eye on it and kind of go up from there. So you would do the same kind of thing with conditioning, where you would, you try to emulate the high intensity, range if you wanted to on some days. So you can do some days with like 20 seconds of work and then a little bit of rest, but you keep your intensity low as you get used to that modality. I think it's also like perfectly fine as well to alternate from the beginning, where you're going to do some days where you do like 100-meter row or something like that, and you'll rest the same amount of time, and then you can kind of build up over time to having the work be a little bit more. So 100-meter row to a 200-meter row to 250-meter row. You also can over time play around with the rest times, where maybe you'll initially be resting twice as much as it took you to do your row or your prowler, and then that decreases over time. So now you do like a 1-to-1 rest, and then you can play around with less rest, right? So the Tabata is very aggressive. Tabata is 20 seconds of work and 10 seconds of rest. So it's incomplete. It's half the amount of rest time. So typically a Tabata is 8 rounds of 20 seconds on, 10 seconds off. So 4 minutes. But that's just, basically the classic Tabata, because it's, it just kind of been pulled from the literature that way, and that's what people use. But, the idea is not the number of rounds per se, so much as really for him, for his study, it was the 20 seconds of work with 10 seconds of rest. That's what he was kind of focusing on in the study he did. Now, again, there's very specific factors involved in studies, right? He used certain males that were, that were not masters athletes, that were on an erg machine, and so forth. So there's going to be variation and stuff like that. But, the idea is that building up these intervals, where you're able to get a relatively high intensity and then you rest, is going to give you that stimulus. It's going to promote the changes to your aerobic and your anaerobic conditioning, But it doesn't have to be 20 and 10 all the time. Again, it can't be. You got to vary it to some extent. You've got to create a program that gets progressively more challenging and has a little bit more complexity as well over time. But, again, start out with something that's manageable, moderate difficulty, see how your body feels and how it responds. The first time you use a new implement, there's probably going to be a little bit more soreness than there would be otherwise. So you definitely want to, judge with that. Like the first time you hop on a rower, the pulling movement and the leg movement at the same time, it might be, you might be sore for the next couple of days. So then you can't do rowing right away after that. You have to kind of adapt to it. So, slower paces initially, more rest initially as you kind of gear up to it. Then you can start playing around with, kind of pushing the envelope a little bit in terms of, the amount of rowing you do or the amount of prowler you do, how much rest you do, and so forth. All right. One more question from Andy. Didn't want to throw away my endurance gains, so I'm attempting to pair. Currently lifting 2 times a week, 1 hour walks, 4 days a week. 4 days a week on one day. Sorry, Well, so walking is not going to be very taxing. So, that's, I think ultimately what you're going to find there is probably it doesn't affect your strength training too much. It probably won't give you a tremendous amount of cardiovascular improvement after a certain while either, because you're going to become adapted to just doing the walking pretty easily. Probably the bigger, I don't know your age, but the bigger restriction would probably be you're only training 2 times a week. Probably would be the limiting factor. You're going to ideally want to have more than 2 times a week training for strength to get the improvements in strength. It's tough to do it with 2 times a week, So I wouldn't worry about walking being an interfering component. Probably just more strength training would be the thing that will hold you up initially. So walking is pretty low impact. It's very low heart rate. So and I mean, people in New York, like a lot of them just walk around in general. That's how they get to and from work. So that gets adapted to pretty well, pretty easily. All right. Any other questions? All right. I think that's it for real this time. Thank you all so much. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any other questions, and stay safe.